I will never forget the look on Victoria's face when the police officer handed me that court order. Her eyes, the same eyes I'd soothed to sleep so many nights when she was little, now looked at me, cold, distant, as if I were a stranger. As if the 32 years of sacrifice, love, and dedication meant absolutely nothing. My name is Isabella Morales. I'm 68 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I lived in the house I built with my late husband, Carlos. The house where I raised my only daughter. The house I naively put in her name, believing I was securing her future. The house she threw me out of with just 2 bags of belongings and my old dog, Lucky. But there's something Victoria doesn't know, a detail that would change everything. Let me tell you how I got here. It all started 15 months ago. I was sitting in the living room, looking at old photographs of Carlos. It had already been 5 years since cancer took him, but his absence still hurt like the first day. Victoria came to visit me that Sunday, as she used to do every couple of weeks. She sat next to me and noticed the tears I was trying to hide. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked, taking my hand in hers. I smiled at her, wiping my cheeks. "Just remembering your father, my love. You know these days are always hard." Victoria nodded and hugged me. Then, as if she had been thinking about it for a long time, she looked at me seriously. "Mom, I've been worried about you. You live all alone in this big house. What if you fall? What if something happens and nobody knows?" Her concern touched me. Since Carlos passed away, she had been my rock, my support, even though she lived in her own apartment across town. "I'm fine, honey. I have Lucky. I have the neighbors who come over for coffee every afternoon. You don't have to worry so much." Victoria shook her head, her expression growing more serious. "It's not just that, Mom. This house needs a lot of maintenance. The roof needs repairs, the pipes are old. If something major breaks, what then? Are you going to pay for it with your Social Security check?" I couldn't deny she was right. The house was over 30 years old, and every winter, new leaks would appear. Carlos had always handled the repairs, but since his death, everything had become more complicated. My pension barely covered the basic necessities, and the money from Carlos's life insurance policy had been used up paying for his medical treatments. "I've been thinking about something," Victoria continued. "What if you put the house in my name? That way, I could take care of all the expenses, the repairs, the property taxes. You could keep living here, of course. Nothing would change in your day-to-day life, except that I'd handle everything else." I looked at her, surprised. I didn't expect that proposal. "But honey, this house is your inheritance. It'll be yours anyway when I'm gone." "Exactly, Mom. But if we wait, you'll have to go through all the probate paperwork. The inheritance taxes are higher. Besides, if we do it now, I can start investing in improving the house. Think about it. A new roof, pipes that don't leak, maybe even that central heating system you always wanted." I had to admit, the offer sounded tempting. The winters were getting harder on me with my arthritis getting worse, and the idea of not having to worry about home maintenance was a relief. "I don't know, Victoria. This house is all I have." "Mom," she said, taking my hands in hers, "trust me. It's just a legal formality. You'll keep living here as long as you want. I promise." Her eyes shone with a sincerity that disarmed me. This was my Victoria, the little girl I had raised with so much love, the woman in whom I had placed all my hopes. How could I not trust her? "All right," I finally agreed. "I'll talk to a lawyer." Victoria smiled widely and hugged me. "Don't you worry about a thing, Mom. I'll take care of all the paperwork. I know an excellent notary." And so it began. Over the next few weeks, Victoria took care of every detail. She brought me documents to sign. She explained each step of the process. Or at least, that's what I thought. I signed so many papers that, honestly, I lost track. I trusted my daughter blindly. A month later, Victoria gave me the news. The house was officially in her name. We celebrated with a special dinner, and she made a toast to a secure future. I remember feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. My daughter would take care of everything, and I could live peacefully. The first few weeks after the transfer, everything seemed normal. Victoria came to visit even more frequently than before. She brought contractors to fix the roof, just as she had promised. She replaced the pipes in the main bathroom. She even hired a landscaper to get the backyard in order. It was then that I met Derek. Victoria brought him to dinner one Friday. Tall, blonde, with a perfect smile and an impeccable suit. At first glance, he seemed like the ideal son-in-law. Derek is a real estate investor, Victoria explained, as he poured the wine they had brought. We met at a finance conference 3 months ago. I remember thinking it was strange that Victoria had never mentioned him before, but the way they looked at each other made me think it was recent and serious. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Morales," Derek said, shaking my hand firmly. "Victoria has told me so much about you. She says you're the strongest woman she knows." His words flattered me, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled me, a calculated coldness that contrasted with his perfect smile. I tried to ignore the feeling, blaming it on my motherly jealousy. After all, Victoria seemed happy, and that was all that mattered. Derek started becoming a part of our lives quickly. He came with Victoria almost every Sunday. He was charming, attentive, always bringing small gifts. Chocolates, flowers, once even a new collar for Lucky. And yet, something inside me remained on alert whenever he was near. It was during one of those Sunday visits that Victoria told me the news. They were engaged. She showed me a ring with a diamond so large it looked fake. They had only been dating for 4 months. "Don't you think it's a little soon, honey?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Victoria looked at me with irritation. "Mom, when you know you've found the right person, you know. Your father and you got married after only 6 months, remember? It was true, but times were different. Carlos and I were young, almost naive. Victoria was 32, with a successful career as an accountant. I expected her to be more cautious. I just want to make sure you know what you're doing," I insisted. Derek intervened then, with that smile that never reached his eyes. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Morales. It's natural to want to protect your daughter. But I promise you, my intentions are serious. I love Victoria, and I want to build a future with her." I nodded, not knowing what else to say. Victoria seemed so in love, so happy. Who was I to ruin that moment? The wedding was 2 months later. A small ceremony in a beautiful garden. Victoria was radiant in her white dress. And I cried, as expected. Part of me cried with joy, seeing my daughter so happy. Another part, one I tried to ignore, cried from a sense of loss I couldn't explain. After the wedding, Victoria's visits became less frequent. She always had an excuse. Work, social commitments with Derek, exhaustion. From visiting every 2 weeks, it went to once a month, then every 6 weeks. When I called, Derek often answered, telling me Victoria was busy and that he'd have her call me back. Calls that were rarely returned. I also started noticing changes around my house. One day, I came home from grocery shopping and found a man taking measurements in the backyard. When I asked him what he was doing, he told me Victoria had hired him to appraise the property. Another time, I opened the door to an elegant couple who said they had an appointment to see the house for sale. I explained there must be a mistake, that my house was not for sale. They left, confused, showing me a listing on their phones. My house, listed at an exorbitant price. I called Victoria immediately. She assured me it was a mistake, that Derek had been looking at similar properties to invest in, and someone had mixed up the addresses. She told me not to worry. But the strange visits continued, and every time I questioned Victoria, she had a perfectly reasonable explanation, always blaming some administrative error or misunderstanding. 6 months after the wedding, on a Sunday morning, Victoria and Derek showed up at my door unannounced. Victoria was wearing an expensive coat I'd never seen before. Derek had that cold smile that now sent a chill down my spine. "Mom, we need to talk," Victoria said, walking in without waiting for an invitation. They sat in my living room, the same room where we had shared so much laughter and so many secrets. Now, however, the atmosphere was tense, as if they were strangers visiting unknown territory. "We've decided to move into this house," Victoria announced without any preamble. I looked at her, confused. "Move in? Here?" "Yes, Mom. Derek and I need more space. His apartment is too small, and since this house is already in my name, it just makes sense for us to move in here." I felt as if the floor was shifting beneath my feet. "But this is my home, Victoria. We agreed that I would keep living here." Victoria and Derek exchanged a look. It was he who spoke, in that smooth, controlled voice that now made my skin crawl. Mrs. Morales, we understand this is difficult for you, but legally, this house belongs to Victoria. The agreement you had was verbal, wasn't it? Victoria, my voice trembled. You promised me. Mom, she interrupted, in a tone I had never heard from her before. Circumstances have changed. Derek and I are going to have a baby. We need this house. The news that in any other circumstance would have filled me with joy now hit me like a knife. A grandchild. Victoria was pregnant and using that to kick me out of my own home? Congratulations, I managed to say, tears welling up in my eyes. But this house is big. We can all live together. The guest room can be the baby's room, and I can help with. It won't work, Derek cut in. Victoria and I need our space. Besides, this house needs major renovations before the baby arrives. It will be better if we find another solution for you. Another solution? My voice sounded distant, as if it belonged to someone else. What do you mean? Victoria pulled some brochures from her purse and spread them on the coffee table. We've been looking into assisted living facilities. There are several really nice ones, with 24-hour medical care. You'd have more company, social activities. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My own daughter, for whom I had given everything, was trying to send me to a nursing home. I'm not going to any facility, I said, with a firmness I didn't know I still had. This is my house. Carlos and I built it brick by brick. My only daughter was born here. My husband died here. I am not leaving. Victoria sighed, as if she were dealing with a stubborn child. Mom, be reasonable. The house is in my name. Legally, I can do whatever I want with it. You promised I could stay here as long as I wanted. You promised me, Victoria. Derek stood up, visibly impatient. Mrs. Morales, I understand your attachment to this house, but you need to understand that it is now Victoria's property. We are offering you a dignified alternative, in a luxury facility. Many people in your situation. In my situation? The rage was beginning to replace the initial shock. And what is my situation exactly, Derek? Being a naive old woman who trusted her daughter. Victoria stood up too, clearly annoyed. This isn't getting us anywhere. We'll give you time to think about it, Mom. 1 week. After that, we expect you to have made a reasonable decision. They left as abruptly as they had arrived, leaving me sitting in my living room with the brochures for retirement homes and a shattered heart. That night, I didn't sleep. I walked through the house that had been my home for 3 decades, touching the walls that held so many memories. Victoria's room, where I had rocked her to sleep so many nights. The kitchen where Carlos and I used to dance while making dinner. The backyard where we had celebrated every birthday, every 4th of July barbecue, every Christmas. How had it come to this? At what point had my sweet Victoria turned into this cold, calculating woman, capable of throwing her own mother out onto the street? I spent the next few days in a sort of trance, unable to process what was happening. I called Victoria several times, but I only ever got Derek, who insisted he would give her the message. On the 5th day, just as I was beginning to consider my options, none of which included a retirement home, the doorbell rang. It was a police officer, accompanied by a man in a suit who identified himself as Victoria's lawyer. Mrs. Morales, the lawyer said, handing me an envelope. This is a court order. You have 48 hours to vacate the property. Any personal effects remaining in the house after that deadline will be considered abandoned. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There must be a mistake, I stammered. This is my house. The lawyer shook his head. The property is registered in the name of Victoria Bennett. She has filed an eviction lawsuit alleging that you are illegally occupying her property. The judge has ruled in her favor. As the man spoke, I saw Victoria's car pull up in front of the house. She got out, wearing that cold expression that now seemed to be her natural state. Behind her, Derek was smiling faintly. Victoria, I pleaded as she approached. You can't do this to me. I'm your mother. She didn't even look me in the eye. 48 hours, Mom. You can take your personal belongings. The rest stays. Where am I supposed to go? Victoria pulled a piece of paper from her purse. I've booked a room for you at the Maple Creek Senior Living Facility. It's paid for 3 months. That's enough time for you to adjust and find a permanent arrangement. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Why, Victoria? Why are you doing this to me? For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But it lasted only a second before Derek put his hand on her shoulder, as if reminding her of something. The house is worth a lot, Mom. With the money from the sale, Derek and I can buy something better, in a more exclusive neighborhood. Something worthy of our son. You're going to sell your childhood home? The house where you grew up? Victoria shrugged. It's just bricks and mortar, Mom. And speaking of which, we need you to give us the keys right now. The police officer, visibly uncomfortable, intervened. Ma'am, it's not necessary for you to hand over the keys now. The order gives you 48 hours. Derek stepped forward. But we'd feel more at ease if you handed them over now, for security. Security? My voice was hoarse, strange. Do you think I'm going to damage my own house? It's not your house anymore, Mom, Victoria said coldly. And frankly, we don't know how you're going to react. At that moment, Lucky started barking from inside the house, sensing my distress. Victoria made a gesture of annoyance. And you'll have to take that dog. We can't keep him. It was that sentence, more than anything else, that showed me how much my daughter had changed. Lucky had been her playmate throughout her entire childhood. She had picked him out at the shelter herself when she was 8 years old. How could she talk about him as if he were a piece of old furniture? I'll take Lucky. Don't you worry, I said with a calmness I didn't feel. And I'll be gone in 48 hours, just like the order says. But I want you to know, Victoria, that one day you will regret this. Not for me, but for you. Because the day you are treated this way by your own child, you will remember this moment. I saw a flash of pain in her eyes, but it was Derek who responded. Don't threaten my wife, Mrs. Morales. You have the court order. 48 hours. They left, the police officer and the lawyer following them, leaving me alone on the porch of what was no longer my home. The next 48 hours were a blur of emotion and activity. How do you pack up 30 years of life in 2 days? What do you take when you can only carry what fits in 2 suitcases? I took the photographs, of course, Carlos's letters, the little treasures that were worthless to anyone else but held a lifetime for me, the blanket my mother had knitted, my father's pocket watch, the first Mother's Day card Victoria ever made me, with her little handprints in pink paint. Lucky watched me pack, confused, as if he understood something terrible was happening. At 12 years old, he was too old for so much uncertainty. Just like me. I called Elena, Carlos's sister. She lived in another city, 2 hours away, but she was the only family I had left. I explained the situation through tears. You come here, Isabella, she said without hesitation. You can stay with me for as long as you need. And bring Lucky, of course. Her kindness only made me cry harder. I don't want to be a burden, Elena. You could never be a burden. You're my sister, even if Carlos isn't with us anymore. Family is family. Words that my own daughter had apparently forgotten. I spent the last night in my house sitting on the back porch, watching the stars with Lucky at my feet. It was the same view I had looked at for 30 years. The same sky under which Carlos and I had dreamed of a future. The same yard where Victoria had taken her first steps. Tomorrow, all of this would belong to someone else. To my daughter, who had decided that the house's real estate value was more important than the memories it held, more important than me. At dawn, I put the last few things in my suitcase. A taxi was waiting to take me to the Greyhound station. I paused for a moment at the front door, allowing myself one last look. Come on, Lucky, I said, my voice barely recognizable as my own. It's time to go. Just as I was closing the door, I saw Victoria's car pull up. She and Derek were coming to make sure I really left, I suppose. I saw my daughter get out of the car, impeccably dressed as always. Our eyes met for a moment. I thought that maybe, at the last minute, she would reconsider, that the daughter I had raised with so much love would come back to me. But she simply pulled out her phone and started talking to someone, turning her back on me. Derek watched me from the car with that cold smile I now understood so well. The taxi driver put my 2 suitcases in the trunk. I helped Lucky get into the back seat. That was it. 30 years of my life reduced to 2 suitcases and an old dog. Where to, ma'am? The driver asked. The bus station, I replied. Without looking back, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. As the taxi pulled away, I remembered the words of Victoria's lawyer. The property is registered in the name of Victoria Bennett. She has filed an eviction lawsuit, alleging that you are illegally occupying her property. And then I remembered something else. Something Victoria and Derek didn't know. Something that would change everything. The journey to Elena's house was long and silent. Lucky slept on my lap, oblivious to the storm of emotions consuming me. Rage, pain, disappointment, but above all, a determination I hadn't felt in a long time. Because there was something Victoria and Derek didn't know, something that had been forgotten in the whirlwind of events. When I arrived at Elena's house, she was waiting for me at the door. She hugged me tight, without asking any questions, and led me inside. Her house was small but cozy, so different from the one I had just lost. She set me up in her guest room and let me rest. That night, after a dinner I barely touched, I told her everything. How Victoria had convinced me to put the house in her name. How she had changed after meeting Derek. The court order, the 48 hours, the humiliation of being thrown out of my own home. Elena listened in silence, her expression shifting from disbelief to outrage. "Isabella," she said finally, "do you remember when you decided to put the house in Victoria's name? Do you remember that Carlos had a lawyer friend, Ernesto Vega?" I nodded slowly. Ernesto had been Carlos's friend since college. He had been at our wedding, at Victoria's baptism. After Carlos died, he had come to visit me several times, offering his help with legal matters. "You talked to him before you signed anything, right?" Elena pressed. "Yes," I remembered suddenly. "Ernesto told me not to sign anything without him reviewing it, and then Victoria brought the papers and—" I stopped, remembering something else. Ernesto had insisted on reviewing the documents before I signed. I had called him to tell him about Victoria's proposal. He had warned me to be careful, to include clauses that would protect me. Ernesto added something to the documents. I said slowly, the memories flooding back. "A clause. The right of a life estate," Elena completed, smiling for the first time that night. "I remember because Carlos and I talked about it when he was sick. Ernesto recommended that if you ever transferred the property to Victoria, you should secure your right to live there until your death." I sat in silence, processing the information. Was it possible? There was a clause in the documents that gave me the right to live in the house, regardless of who the owner was. But what about the court order? I began. "Victoria and that husband of hers probably don't know anything about that clause," Elena said. "I bet neither of them bothered to read the original documents. And if the lawyer they hired didn't do his job correctly—" A small flame of hope ignited within me. "I need to call Ernesto." Elena looked at her watch. "It's late, but first thing tomorrow morning, we'll call him. You rest now. Tomorrow is a new day." That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept soundly. The next morning, Elena woke me with coffee and news. She had gotten a hold of Ernesto and briefly told him the situation. He was expecting us at his office at 10 o'clock. We arrived on time. Ernesto, now with more gray hair but the same kind smile I remembered, greeted us with a hug. "Isabella, I am so sorry about all of this," he said, motioning for us to sit. "Elena gave me some details, but I need you to tell me exactly what happened." For the next hour, I recounted everything. Victoria's proposal, the documents I signed, the wedding to Derek, the changes in her behavior, and finally, the eviction order. Ernesto took notes, his expression growing more and more grim. When I finished, he took off his glasses and looked at me directly. "Isabella, do you remember I insisted on reviewing all the documents before you signed them?" I nodded. "Yes, you came to the house and we went over them together." "Exactly. And I added a specific clause, a life estate. It means that even though the property is in Victoria's name, you have the legal right to live there until your death. It's a right that cannot be revoked, not even by the property owner. So the court order, it's invalid?" "Completely," Ernesto affirmed. "The judge who issued it likely had no knowledge of this clause. Victoria and her lawyer must have only presented the title deed without mentioning the life estate. That's fraud upon the court." A mix of relief and rage washed over me. "Can I get my house back?" You not only can, Isabella. You must. What Victoria has done is illegal. We need to act fast, before they sell the property. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal activity. Ernesto filed a lawsuit against Victoria and Derek, alleging procedural fraud and the violation of my rights as the life tenant. He also requested an injunction to prevent them from selling the house while the case was being resolved. During that whole time, I stayed with Elena. Her unconditional support was the only thing that kept me afloat. Her and Lucky, who seemed to have a new lease on life in her spacious backyard. A month later, we received the news. The judge had ruled in our favor. The eviction order was nullified, and my right to a life estate on the property was officially recognized. What does this mean exactly? I asked Ernesto when we met to discuss the ruling. It means, Isabella, that you can go back to your house. You legally have the right to live there for the rest of your days. Victoria is still the owner, but she cannot prevent you from living in the house, nor can she sell it to anyone without respecting your life estate. And if they refuse? Elena asked, ever practical. Ernesto smiled, a smile that reminded me so much of Carlos it almost made me cry. If they refuse, we will have the judgment enforced, with police assistance if necessary. I couldn't help a small smile of satisfaction. The thought of returning to my house, of reclaiming my home, filled me with a joy I hadn't felt in weeks. When can we do it? I asked. Tomorrow morning, Ernesto replied. I've coordinated with the courthouse. An officer will come with us to execute the judgment. That night I barely slept, but for the first time, it was from anticipation, not anguish. Lucky seemed to sense my excitement. He didn't leave my side all night. The next morning, Ernesto came to pick up Elena and me. Lucky rode in the back seat, his head sticking out the window like when he was a puppy. On the way, Ernesto explained what we could expect. Victoria and Derek will probably be surprised. They might react with hostility. Let me handle the legal part. The officer is there to ensure everything proceeds peacefully. I nodded, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. I didn't know how I would react seeing Victoria after everything that had happened. Part of me was still hurt, betrayed. Another part, the mother I would always be, longed for a reconciliation I knew was unlikely. When we arrived at the house, my heart skipped a beat. There was a for sale sign in the front yard. Derek was outside, talking to what looked like a real estate agent. They both turned as our car pulled up. Derek's face went from surprise to anger in a matter of seconds. He said something to the agent and walked quickly toward our car. "What are you doing here?" he snapped as we got out. Ernesto took the lead, introducing himself and handing him a copy of the court judgment. "Mr. Bennett, we are here to execute this judgment. Mrs. Morales holds a life estate on this property, and we are going to reinstate her today." Derek looked at the document as if it were a venomous snake. "This is ridiculous. We own this house legally." "Your wife acquired the property," Ernesto corrected, "but with a clear life estate clause in favor of Mrs. Morales. A clause you conveniently forgot to mention when you filed for the eviction order." At that moment, the police officer accompanying us stepped in. "Sir, I have orders to ensure this judgment is carried out. Please provide Mrs. Morales with access, or I will have to report you for obstruction of justice." Derek looked around as if searching for an escape. Finally, he pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my lawyer. And Victoria." "Go right ahead," Ernesto said calmly. "In the meantime, we're going to proceed." The real estate agent, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, mumbled something about coming back later and left quickly. We walked toward the front door, Lucky trotting faithfully beside me. I felt a wave of emotions as I stepped back onto the porch I had swept so many times, where Carlos and I had spent so many evenings watching the sunset. Derek followed us, talking heatedly on the phone. I could hear fragments. "Your mother. A lawyer. Life estate. Police." The officer asked if I had keys. I shook my head. Victoria had taken them from me on the day of the eviction. He rang the doorbell. No one answered. "The house looks empty," Elena remarked. Derek finished his call and approached us, visibly agitated. "Victoria is on her way. So is my lawyer. This is a mistake." "There is no mistake, Mr. Bennett," the officer said firmly. "I have a valid court judgment. Do you have the keys to the property?" Derek hesitated, but finally pulled a set of keys from his pocket. "This is an outrage," he muttered as he reluctantly opened the door. Entering my home after a month's absence was like breathing again after being underwater. Despite the obvious changes, new furniture, freshly painted walls, the smell, the light coming through the windows, it all felt familiar. A part of me. Lucky ran inside, sniffing every corner excitedly, recognizing his territory. I smiled, seeing him so happy. "All right," the officer said, consulting some papers. "According to the judgment, Mrs. Morales has the right to reside on this property without interference. Mr. Bennett, are there any belongings of yours or your wife's that you wish to remove now?" Derek seemed surprised by the question. "Remove? This is our house. We've done renovations, bought new furniture. The furniture and improvements can stay," Ernesto intervened. "Mrs. Morales is only reclaiming her right to live here, not the ownership of the personal property you have acquired." "This is absurd." Derek's mood shifted from disbelief to fury. "You expect us to just leave all our furniture, our things, and walk away?" "You can take your personal effects," Ernesto clarified calmly. "But what is part of the house, like fixed furnishings, appliances, and so on, must remain. It is part of the life estate." Derek was about to respond when we heard a car screech to a halt outside. Moments later, Victoria burst into the house, followed by a man in a suit I assumed was her lawyer. Our eyes met, and for an instant, I saw my little girl again. The child who ran into my arms when she scraped her knees. The teenager who cried on my shoulder over a broken heart. The young woman who had hugged me at Carlos's funeral, promising we would always be together. But the moment passed, and the woman in front of me had cold, calculating eyes. Eyes she had inherited, not from me, but from her father. Carlos had always had that look when he was furious. "What is going on here?" Victoria demanded. Her lawyer, who had already taken the judgment from Derek's hand, stepped in. "Mrs. Bennett, it appears there is a life estate clause in favor of your mother in the original property transfer agreement." "A what?" Victoria looked at me accusingly, as if I had laid a trap. "A life estate," her lawyer repeated, visibly uncomfortable. "It means your mother has the legal right to live on this property until her death, regardless of who the owner island." Victoria turned pale. "That's impossible. We reviewed all the documents. Apparently not with enough care," Ernesto murmured. "I'm going to fight this," Victoria said, snatching the papers from her lawyer. "There must be some mistake, some way to invalidate it." Victoria's lawyer, a young man who looked increasingly uneasy, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Bennett, if I may." He took the judgment and studied it carefully. Then he pulled out his tablet and looked something up. Finally, he looked up with a grim expression. "I'm afraid the judgment appears to be correct. A life estate is a real property right that cannot be unilaterally revoked. If it's in the original contract and your mother did not expressly waive it." "She gave us the house!" Victoria exclaimed. "I gave you the property," I corrected, finding my voice for the first time since she'd walked in. "But I never gave up my right to live here. Something I explained clearly to you when I agreed to put the house in your name." Victoria looked at me as if she wanted to erase me from existence. Then she turned to her lawyer. "There must be something we can do." The man shook his head. "We can appeal, but frankly, if the life estate is clearly established in the original contract, our chances are very slim." Derek, who had been unusually quiet, exploded. "This is ridiculous. We bought this house to flip it. We already have offers." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place in my mind. "You never wanted to live here, did you? That whole story about the baby, about needing more space. It was just to get me out so you could sell the house." Victoria had the decency to look ashamed, if only for an instant. "The house is in an area that has appreciated enormously. It's a good investment." "A good investment?" I repeated, incredulous. "Throwing your own mother out of her home is a good investment?" Derek interrupted. "Sentimentality doesn't pay the bills, Mrs. Morales. This house can sell for 3 times what it was worth when you bought it. And that money is exactly what you need to pay off your gambling debts, isn't it, Derek?" I said, remembering the whispered conversations I had overheard between them, the mysterious phone calls, his growing nervousness. Derek's expression confirmed I had hit the nail on the head. Victoria looked at him, surprised. What is he talking about, Derek? Don't listen to her, he said quickly. Your mother is making things up to turn us against each other. But Victoria was no longer looking at him with the same adoration. A shadow of doubt had appeared in her eyes. The police officer, who had been observing quietly, spoke up. I believe we've established that Mrs. Morales has the right to reside here. I suggest you resolve your family matters in private. My duty is to ensure the judgment is carried out today. Victoria looked at her lawyer, who nodded in resignation. Legally, your mother has a right to be here. We can appeal, but in the meantime, the judgment must be obeyed. This isn't over, Victoria warned me, grabbing her purse. Let's go, Derek. Derek looked ready to argue, but something in Victoria's expression stopped him. With one last glare in my direction, he followed his wife outside. Once we were alone, Ernesto, Elena, the officer, and I looked at each other in silence for a moment. Then, unable to stop myself, I sat down on the sofa, a new one I didn't recognize, and burst into tears. Tears of relief, of pain, of bitter victory. Elena sat beside me, holding me. Lucky jumped onto the sofa and rested his head on my lap, just as he had done 1,000 times before. You're home, Isabella, Elena whispered. You're home. The officer said his goodbyes, promising to return if there were any problems. Ernesto stayed a while longer, explaining the legal details of the situation. Victoria was still the owner of the house, but I had the right to live there until my death. They couldn't force me to leave, nor could they sell the house without informing the buyer of my life estate, which made the house virtually unsellable. You won, Isabella, Ernesto said before he left. Now try to rebuild your life. Easier said than done. The next few days were strange. The house was changed. Victoria and Derek had almost completely redecorated, throwing out much of my old furniture, the pieces that held so many memories. The walls had been painted in neutral, modern, cold tones. The garden, my pride and joy, had been turned into a minimalist space with rocks and a few exotic plants. But under all those changes, it was still my house. The pipes still made that characteristic noise when the hot water was turned on. The third stair still creaked in the same way. The evening light still poured through the kitchen window, illuminating everything with that golden glow Carlos had loved so much. Elena stayed with me that first week, helping me rearrange the few things I had brought back. We placed the photographs in new spots, adapting to the changes but reclaiming the space as my own again. Victoria and Derek didn't come back, nor did they call. Their silence was deafening, but it was also a relief. I needed time to process everything that had happened, to heal. One morning, 2 weeks after my return, I heard the doorbell while I was having breakfast in the kitchen. It was Victoria, alone. She looked different, less haughty, more like the daughter I remembered. Can I come in? She asked in a quiet voice. I hesitated for a moment but finally stepped aside, letting her in. Lucky, who usually greeted any visitor effusively, kept his distance, watching her cautiously. We sat in the kitchen in an uncomfortable silence. Finally, Victoria spoke. Derek is gone, she said simply. I looked at her, waiting for more of an explanation. You were right, she continued. The gambling debts were worse than I imagined. $500,000 to some dangerous loan sharks. That's why he was so desperate to sell this house. I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected at having my suspicions confirmed, only a deep sadness for my daughter. Where is he now? I asked. Victoria shrugged. I don't know. He left a note, said he got money from another source and needed time to sort out his life. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. Victoria looked at me, surprised. You're sorry? After everything we did to you? You're my daughter, I said simply. Your pain will always be my pain. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve you being so good to me. I didn't answer. It was true she didn't. But a mother's love doesn't work in terms of what's deserved. And the baby? I asked after a moment, remembering the excuse they had used to kick me out. Victoria looked down. There is no baby. There never was. It was Derek's idea, to make you feel guilty if you resisted. The calculated cruelty of that lie hurt me more than anything else, to play with something as sacred as a grandchild. But I said nothing. What was there left to say? I'm filing for divorce, Victoria continued, and I'm going to try to fix things, starting with giving you the house back." I looked at her, surprised. "You don't have to." "I do," she insisted. "I never should have gone along with his plan. It was a terrible, unforgivable mistake." "Nothing is unforgivable between a mother and daughter," I said softly. Victoria broke down then, with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. I stood up and held her, feeling her body tremble against mine, just like when she was little and had nightmares. "I'm sorry, Mom," she repeated through her tears. "I'm so sorry." I forgave her, of course. Not immediately, not completely, but I started that day. The road to reconciliation would be long, filled with difficult conversations and wounds that would be slow to heal. Victoria had betrayed my trust in the worst possible way, and that isn't easily forgotten. But she was my daughter, the little one I had rocked to sleep, the girl whose scraped knees I had bandaged, the young woman whose tears I had dried. A mother's love is perhaps the most resilient force in the universe. 6 months later, the house was legally back in my name. Victoria insisted on it as part of her process of making amends. Derek disappeared completely from our lives, though occasional rumors of his new troubles in another city would surface. Victoria and I began a new relationship, more mature, more honest. She moved back to her apartment, but came to visit regularly, not out of obligation, but by choice. Slowly, we rebuilt our trust. A year after my return, we were sitting on the back porch, looking at the garden we had replanted together, restoring it to its former glory. Lucky was dozing at our feet, a very old but happy dog now. "Do you know what hurt the most?" I asked Victoria, feeling we could finally talk about it without the pain being unbearable. She looked at me, waiting. "It wasn't losing the house, it was losing you. Seeing who you had become." Victoria nodded, tears in her eyes. "I know, and that's what I'll never completely forgive myself for. Not the court order, not the lies, but betraying everything you taught me about love, family, and integrity." I took her hand. "But you came back. You chose the right path in the end. Thanks to you," she said, "to your strength, your dignity. To that one detail we forgot to check in the documents." I smiled, remembering the look on Victoria's face when she found out I had a legal right to stay in the house. "The life estate. Your father's foresight. Through Ernesto. Dad was always looking out for us, even after he was gone," Victoria murmured. "Yes," I agreed, looking at the sky as it began to turn orange. "Always." That evening, after Victoria left, I stayed a while longer on the porch with Lucky. The house was mine again, legally, and in every way that mattered. My daughter had come back to me, not as the person manipulated by Derek, but as the Victoria I had raised. Life had taken a lot from me, Carlos, too soon, almost my home and temporarily my daughter. But it had also given me so much back. My dignity, my home, my rebuilt family, and it had taught me an invaluable lesson. That even in the darkest moments, when it seems like you've lost everything, there is always one detail, small but crucial, that can change everything. In my case, it was a legal clause that Derek and Victoria overlooked. But it was also my inner strength, the strength I didn't know I had until I was forced to use it. Today, sitting on the porch of the house I almost lost, with the daughter I almost lost, and the dog that never left my side, I am at peace. This is my house, my home, and no one will ever take it from me again.